Hello, everybody. My name is Martyn Lyons, and I'm here to talk about the new Spanish edition of my book, A History of Reading and Writing in the West. There maybe has been a little more research done on writing practices since then. And if I had to start the book again now, I think I would perhaps try to change the balance a little bit between reading and writing. For example, there's been quite a lot of new work on the history of graffiti, historical graffiti, which is very interesting in prisons, in the prisons of the Inquisition and other places of detention over the centuries. Graffiti is a very ancient practice and a very widespread writing practice as well, even though most of the authors are totally unknown to us. Another thing I'd say is that we know still very little about numeracy, which is, I think, an important part of literacy, about the thousands of people who perhaps could not read or write in the past, but who could still count and do simple calculations, which they needed to do as part of their everyday life and to conduct transactions of all sorts. How did people negotiate the change from using Roman numerals to Arabic numerals? How did that affect simple everyday calculations? Those sorts of questions really need to be investigated further. We have prioritized reading over writing. I think there's maybe two big reasons for that. It just has seemed essential for a liberal democratic society to have a well-read electorate, to have well-informed, critical readers. And the newspaper press has been a very important element of that idea. Reading has seemed essential for being a good worshipper, a good citizen, and a good student. So reading has always been, if you like, dominant and writing recessive in the way we thought about literacy, the way we've actually put it into our educational systems as well. And I think the second reason is writing has been less studied because historically it was a rarer skill. Until the mid 19th century, writing was taught quite separately from reading. You learned to read, and then if you wanted to go further, if you wanted to pay more as well, you could go on and learn how to write as well. So this meant that many fewer people knew how to write than knew how to read. So those are two reasons for this imbalance between reading and writing, and historians have reproduced that. But this, I think, has to change. Digitization has now really has made everybody into a writer. We're all writing freely. We have to take writing much more seriously, I think, as a central component of literacy. I guess the history of writing has to begin with Sumer in the Middle East, with the beginnings of marks made on wet clay with a wedge, which was done to make records mainly for bureaucratic and administrative purposes in that ancient civilization. In ancient China, we have all sorts of materials used for writing. Bamboo, for instance, silk, porcelain, and so on. Another milestone has to be the introduction of papyrus, pages made from reed, which really came from Egypt, and then parchment, writing on animal skins, in other words, which started from Turkey in about the second century, I think, before the Christian era. And parchment, of course, had a big advantage. It was durable and it could be recycled. You could scrape the surface of the skin, whether it was a sheep skin, a calf skin, whatever, and you could use it again. You could rewrite on it. A very important milestone was certainly the introduction of paper, which came to Europe, it came to Spain, in fact, from China via the Arabs. They changed the techniques a little bit. That the European paper was different from Chinese paper, which is always very thin. At first, of course, there was a prejudice against paper. It was a Muslim invention, and it was also very fragile. For a long time, actually, governments preferred to keep their records on parchment because it endured for longer. But paper, of course, was so much cheaper and convenient, and it won over. Before paper, to produce a Bible, for instance, hundreds of animals had to be slaughtered to get the skins and to scrape them, to cure them, and so on. And now, of course, we just cut down the forests. In the 19th century itself, there were several important milestones. Paper, which was at first made from rags, discarded cloth, which was pulped, started to be made from wood pulp instead, from trees and from wood. And that made a big difference. It was much cheaper. Paper had always been the most expensive item in a publisher's budget, but this changed everything. And then for individuals, instead of using quills, goose quills or feathers from some other bird, steel pens were introduced and was used from about the 1830s onwards. Then, of course, at the end of the century, you have the typewriter. And then I think probably the last milestone I would mention before the computer is something that very important that happened actually in Buenos Aires in the 1940s, when a Hungarian immigrant patented the ballpoint pen, Biro, Laszlo Biro. Production, very small scale in the 1940s. It wasn't cheap either, but it was very convenient. And of course, it made writing very simple for millions and millions of people. Because commentators and journalists, when they want to tell you how important the changes brought about by computerization, word processing, digitization are, they look for a comparison to emphasize how world-shattering those changes were, and they think of Gutenberg. And they frequently are saying that this is the greatest change since Gutenberg invented the printing press. My reaction to that is that all? Is that all? Because Gutenberg, to me, was not all that revolutionary. I think the computer is much more of a revolutionary invention in the history of reading and writing. Of course, you have to remember, first of all, that printing was not invented in the West. The Chinese used printing. The Koreans used printing before Gutenberg began his research on metal type and different forms of ink. But the printing press itself was a Western invention, and of course, it eventually enabled the circulation of much more material than before. But it didn't change the nature of the codex. The codex still had the same physical form that it had before the printing press. And although print maybe, Elizabeth Eisenstein shows this, it affected the lives of scholars. You didn't have to go miles to find a rare copy of a book you wanted to consult anymore. But although it might have affected the lives of intellectuals in that way, it didn't change the lives of ordinary people, at least not for centuries, because most of them were still illiterate. So I think it's important to stress this. My book plays down a little bit the idea that the printing press was completely revolutionary. I think that's a mistake widely made by students and by the general public. Since the Enlightenment, maybe we've tended to see the printing press as one of the great Western inventions that changed the Western world. But we need to remember that books existed for maybe 2,000 years before printing, and printing didn't alter, as I say, the material shape of the book. The computer, I think, was much more revolutionary. I think today we have to accept that the codex has been dethroned. It's been desacralized. It doesn't have the dominant place that it used to do, but it lives on nevertheless. It lives on in the educational world, in schools, in universities. It has a very important role. And I think although various electronic devices, Kindles and so on, started to take the place of paper, the hard copy, the bound pages of the codex, reading on screen has not made the codex obsolete. I think reading on books on screens seems to have reached a kind of plateau. A lot of evidence suggests that devices like Kindles absorb maybe 20% of the book market, but they haven't made the codex disappear. And we're still consuming mountains of paper. I mean, you would think this would have changed, but it hasn't. We still need more and more paper. So I would just say that the book has fallen from its pedestal, but it still has a very important role. After all, it's a very useful device in many ways. You don't have to plug it in to an electricity supply. It doesn't need regular updates. It isn't affected by viruses and it can't be hacked. It has a few advantages. My response to that question is probably a little bit pessimistic. Global illiteracy is increasing in absolute terms. The literacy rate, the percentage, may be increasing, but the number of people who are illiterate is getting bigger all the time. There, of course, have been various attempts to attack this, led by UNESCO and individual campaigns. The campaign of the Soviet Union under Stalin, for example. Nicaragua also more recently is quite a well-known example of a serious literacy campaign. Most of those attempts have failed, or they've had very mediocre results in comparison to the amount of money and the effort that's been put in to make a lot of people more literate. And in many of those wars against illiteracy, the criteria for success have been very misleading. Just setting up a primary school where there wasn't one before doesn't make people literate in itself. You've got to persuade people to send their kids there. You've got to persuade them to attend. And often there's a lot of popular resistance, there always has been, to schooling because it takes the kids out of the economy. It means not just a loss of time, but a loss of income for many peasant families. What I've learned from studying this question is that people only learn to read and write if they have an incentive, if they see some tangible benefit in doing so. A peasant ploughing his field, gathering his crop, doesn't need to read and write. Why should he? Why should he? There has to be a reason. The incentive is really the key. Will reading and writing lead to a different job? Will it make a difference to somebody's life? Or will they forget the skill later over time when they get older, simply because they haven't been using it very much, which happens a lot. That's what we call regressive literacy. So I think I mentioned in the book the rate of illiteracy in the Middle East, in Africa, in some Islamic countries as well, particularly female illiteracy. I think it's not going to achieve very much to teach, let us say, women in Afghanistan to read and write if they're not allowed to make use of those skills in society, if they're banned from various activities and various jobs. There has to be a broader social change. Education and literacy, in other words, don't change society on their own. They have to be in a context. And so I said I was probably going to be pessimistic. I think illiteracy is something we have to live with. I think it's something up to a point that we have to accept. It's not going to go away suddenly. And it's maybe an inevitable part of literate societies.